You're the help, not his family. Stop acting like it." The words were low, sharp, and honed to a fine point. Marcus Vance delivered them with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He stood silhouetted against the tall, mullioned windows of his father's study, a figure of expensive tailoring and cold authority. The late afternoon sun bled around his frame, casting the rest of the room in a warm, amber twilight that felt entirely at odds with the chill in the air. Alina Reyes didn't flinch. She kept her attention on them. Her movements were a study in quiet efficiency as she adjusted the cashmere pillow behind his head. Arthur, with skin like parchment and hands that trembled with a fine, persistent tremor, leaned into her touch. His cloudy eyes, the same shade of faded blue as his son's, found hers. A silent message passed between them, one of comfort, of trust, of shared history that Marcus could never comprehend. "Father," Marcus said, his voice tightening with impatience, "I'm speaking." Arthur's hand, thin and riddled with swollen knuckles, lifted from the armrest and reached for Alina's. It was a slow, deliberate gesture, a desperate anchor in a turbulent sea. Before his fingers could find their purchase, Marcus moved. He crossed the Persian rug in 2 long strides, his polished Oxford sinking into the deep pile without a sound. He placed himself directly between them, a human wall of tweed and disapproval. "That's enough," he commanded, not looking at his father but at Alina. His gaze was a physical force intended to diminish, to erase. "You are here to perform a function. You are not his confidante. You are not his emotional support." Alina straightened up, her hands falling to her sides. She met Marcus's stare, her own expression a placid mask that betrayed nothing of the storm within. She had been Arthur Vance's caregiver, his shadow, the keeper of his routines and his dignity for 7 years. She knew the precise temperature he liked his tea, the way he preferred his newspaper folded, the name of the childhood dog he still whispered in his sleep. She knew the hollow, haunted look that came over him when the house grew too quiet, and she knew the specific lullaby that could soothe it away. Marcus knew his father's net worth. Would you endure this? To have years of devotion reduced to a mere function? "My apologies, Mr. Vance," Alina said, her voice soft but clear, carrying no trace of the subservience he demanded. The formal address seemed to irritate him further. "It's not an apology I want, it's compliance." He gestured around the room at the towering shelves of leather-bound books, the heavy mahogany desk, the faint scent of old paper and beeswax. "This is my home, my father, my responsibility. Your role here is conditional. It seems you've forgotten that." Arthur stirred in his chair. A weak, reedy sound escaped his lips. "Marcus, don't." "Father, please," Marcus cut him off, the veneer of concern so thin it was transparent. He turned slightly, patting Arthur's shoulder in a gesture that was more possessive than affectionate. "I'm handling this. We need to establish clear, professional boundaries, for your own good." Alina watched the exchange, her heart aching for the old man's helplessness. Arthur had built an empire from nothing, a man whose voice had once commanded boardrooms and sent stock prices soaring. Now, he couldn't even command his own son in his own study. He was a king in exile, and Marcus was the usurper, dismantling his world one quiet cruelty at a time. The trap was not just for her, it was for him. She understood Marcus perfectly. He didn't see care, he saw influence. He didn't see a bond, he saw a threat to his inheritance. He looked at his father's affection for her and saw a weakness he needed to cauterize before it cost him something. The old man was becoming more attached to the help than to his own blood, and in Marcus's world, that was a dangerous imbalance of power. "From now on," Marcus continued, turning his full attention back to Alina, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more menacing than a shout, "you will attend only to your stated duties. Housekeeping, laundry, meal preparation, nothing more. You do not engage in conversation unless you are spoken to first. You do not offer comfort. You are a presence, not a participant. Am I understood?" She held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. In that silent moment, she let him see that she was not intimidated. She was not a simple woman to be dismissed. She was a witness. He was cataloging her as an obstacle, but he had no idea of the landscape he was navigating. He saw a maid in a simple gray uniform. He didn't see the woman Arthur Vance had entrusted with his deepest secrets. Finally, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. Perfectly, Mr. Vance. He seemed satisfied, mistaking her composure for surrender. He gave a curt nod of his own and walked towards the door. Good, he said over his shoulder. Then we'll have no more problems. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving a profound silence in its wake, Alina turned back to Arthur. The fight had drained him. His head was slumped against the side of the wingback, his eyes closed. His hand was still outstretched, his fingers curled around the empty air where hers should have been. Very gently, she reached down and took his hand, her warmth enveloping his cold, fragile fingers. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they were clear. He saw her, really saw her. He doesn't know, does he, Lena? Arthur whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. No, Arthur, she replied softly, squeezing his hand. He doesn't know a thing. The heavy oak door had barely clicked shut when another, lighter one opened. Caroline Vance, Marcus's wife, glided into the study. She was a woman assembled from sharp angles and expensive fabrics, her smile as carefully constructed as her pearl necklace. She surveyed the room, her eyes flicking over Alina before settling on her husband. Is everything all right, darling? She asked, her voice a smooth, cultured whisper. Marcus, who had been staring out the window, turned. The hard lines of his face softened into a more socially acceptable mask of weary responsibility. Just a staffing matter, setting boundaries. You know how these things can get. Caroline's gaze drifted to Arthur, who was now feigning sleep, a defense mechanism he'd perfected over the years. Then her eyes landed on the worn, hand-knitted blanket draped over the arm of his chair, where Alina had placed it after retrieving it. It was a simple thing, made of soft merino wool in shades of heather gray and deep ocean blue. Alina had knitted it for him 2 winters ago, when his circulation had grown poor. Oh, that dreadful thing, Caroline said with a delicate shudder. Marcus, you simply must get rid of it. It's a fire hazard, I'm sure, and it looks so provincial. She walked over to the chair and, using only the tips of her fingers as if touching something contaminated, she plucked the blanket off the armrest and tossed it onto a low ottoman near the cold fireplace. The gesture was one of pure, unadulterated disdain. Arthur's eyes shot open. A small, wounded sound escaped his lips, and he flinched as if he'd been struck. He loved that blanket. It was his comfort, his shield. Its weight was a familiar pressure. It sent a mixture of lavender from Alina's sachets and the faint, clean smell of his own home. To see it discarded like trash was a physical blow. Alina's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible ripple along her otherwise serene face. She saw Caroline's act for what it was, a territorial marking, a reassertion of her status as mistress of the house. The blanket was not just a blanket. It was a symbol of the quiet, intimate care Alina provided, a care that Caroline and Marcus could neither replicate nor tolerate. By dismissing it, they were dismissing her, and by extension, the part of Arthur that relied on her. Would you tolerate this? Seeing a gift of love treated like garbage, simply to make a point about your place in the world? Without waiting for permission, Alina moved. She crossed the room, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the rug. She bent down and picked up the blanket from the ottoman. She didn't look at Caroline. She didn't look at Marcus. She simply held the soft wool in her hands for a moment, then began to fold it with a precision that was almost reverent. A perfect square, then a neat rectangle. Each crease was a small act of defiance. Each smooth, deliberate motion was a reclamation of dignity, both hers and Arthur's. She placed the folded blanket on the small table beside Arthur's chair, within his easy reach. There, she said softly, her voice the only sound in the tense, silent room. Caroline's lips thinned into a bloodless line. She shot a furious look at Marcus, an unspoken demand for him to put this impertinent servant back in her place. Marcus cleared his throat, his authority momentarily shaken. Alina, that was not your decision to make. My apologies, Mr. Vance, she replied, turning to face him, her eyes calm and direct. I was merely putting it away. It was a masterful deflection. She hadn't disobeyed. She hadn't argued. She had simply performed a housekeeping task, using his own rules against him. She had taken their insult, absorbed its venom, and transformed it into an act of quiet service. Marcus was left speechless, outmaneuvered by the one person in the house he considered to have no power at all. He saw the flicker of admiration in his father's eyes and the flash of fury in his wife's. He knew in that moment that setting boundaries wasn't enough. Alina had to go. An hour later, the summons came. A different maid, a younger woman named Maria who always seemed to be trembling, knocked on Alina's door in the staff wing. "Mr. Vance wants to see you," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and pity. In the main office. Alina knew what this was, the final move in a game she had seen coming for months. She smoothed the front of her simple gray dress, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked the long, silent corridors to the heart of the house. The main office was Marcus's domain, a cold, modern space of glass and steel that stood in stark contrast to the warm, lived-in comfort of his father's study. Marcus sat behind a vast desk of black marble, a laptop open before him, though he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at her, his expression one of grim satisfaction. Standing slightly behind him was a young man in a suit, a junior lawyer who clutched a leather portfolio to his chest like a shield. "Alina," Marcus began, dispensing with any pretense of politeness. "Please sit." He gestured to a hard, minimalist chair opposite the desk. She remained standing. His eye twitched. "As I was saying earlier, there have been some concerns about professional boundaries, about your role in this household becoming confused." Alina said nothing. She let the silence stretch, forcing him to fill it. She would not make this easy for him. He faltered for a second, then pressed on, his voice taking on a rehearsed corporate tone. "After careful consideration, my wife and I have decided that it is in my father's best interest to make a change. We will be transitioning his care to a certified nursing agency, effective immediately." He slid 2 documents across the vast, empty expanse of the marble desk. One was a check. The other was a thick sheaf of papers, bound and menacing. "This is a generous severance package," Marcus said, pointing to the check. 6 months' salary. In return, you will sign this." He tapped the bound document. "It's a standard non-disclosure agreement. It simply states that you will not discuss any aspect of your employment here or any private matters concerning the Vance family with anyone. Ever." He leaned back, the picture of magnanimous authority. "Sign this," he said, his voice dropping, the command clear and absolute, "and be gone by morning. A car will be arranged for you at 6 a.m. Your personal effects will be shipped to any address you provide. Do not speak to my father again." This was it, the point of no return, exile, erasure. He wasn't just firing her, he was attempting to surgically remove her from their lives to scrub the last 7 years from history. He was severing the one bond that gave Arthur Vance a reason to greet the day. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. What would you do next, if faced with such a cold, final dismissal? Alina looked from Marcus's smug face to the papers on the desk. This wasn't just a severance, it was a gag order. He was buying her silence, ensuring no one would ever hear about his father's true wishes, about his loneliness, about the promise he'd made Alina keep. He was isolating his father completely, paving the way for whatever plans he had for the man and his estate. She looked at the signature line on the last page, waiting for her name, her surrender. Then she looked up, her gaze meeting the junior lawyer's. He quickly looked away, a faint flush of shame coloring his cheeks. He knew this was wrong. Alina finally reached for the document, her movements slow and deliberate. Marcus smiled, a tight, triumphant curl of his lips. He thought he had won. Alina didn't pick up the pen. She picked up the NDA, its weight substantial in her hands. Marcus's smile faltered slightly as she began to read, not with the cursory glance of a maid, but with a focused, analytical intensity that was unnervingly out of character. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the dense blocks of legalese. The junior lawyer shifted his weight, his discomfort growing. She stopped on the 7th page. She read a paragraph, then read it again. Her finger, clean but unmanicured, traced a single line of text. The room was utterly silent, save for the faint hum of the computer. Finally, she looked up, her gaze not on Marcus but on the young lawyer. "You drafted this?" she asked. Her tone was not accusatory but conversational, almost academic. The lawyer swallowed, surprised to be addressed directly. Yes, from our firm's standard template." "You should ask for your money back," Alina said calmly. She laid the document back on the desk, turning it to face him. She tapped the paragraph she had been studying. "Clause 7B regarding liquidated damages in the event of a breach." You've stipulated a punitive sum that is wildly disproportionate to any potential actual damages. The state Supreme Court ruled such clauses unenforceable last year in Albright v. Sterling. It creates an interim effect, which is contrary to public policy. She paused, then added, "Furthermore, the document lacks a severability clause, which means if a single provision like this one is found to be invalid, a judge could rule the entire agreement void." She looked at Marcus, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "It's an expensive piece of paper, but legally, it's worthless." The silence that followed was profound. The junior lawyer's face had gone pale, his professional confidence shattered by a woman in a housekeeper's uniform. He opened his mouth, then closed it, knowing she was right. Marcus stared at her, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Where did a maid learn terms like interim and severability? He felt a sudden, dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He had built his entire strategy on the assumption of her ignorance, of her powerlessness. That assumption had just been dismantled with a few quiet, surgically precise sentences. Did you catch what she just did? She didn't just refuse to sign. She disarmed him. For the first time, a sliver of doubt entered Marcus's mind. Who was this woman? He had looked at her every day for 7 years and had never truly seen her. He'd seen a function, a role, a uniform. Now he was seeing something else entirely, something he couldn't categorize or control, and it terrified him. The small win was hers, but she knew it was temporary. The look on his face told her he wouldn't be undermined again. Defying Marcus's explicit order, Alina knew she couldn't leave without seeing Arthur. She used the service stairs, her movements swift and silent, a ghost in the house she knew better than anyone. She found him not in his study but in his bedroom, standing by the window that overlooked the dormant rose garden. The new nurse, a stern-looking woman with a clipboard, was trying to coax him into taking his evening medication. "It's for your own good, Mr. Vance," the nurse said in a patronizingly bright voice. Arthur simply shook his head, his gaze fixed on the tangled, thorny canes outside. He looked smaller, diminished, the vibrant spark in his eyes already fading. Alina waited until the nurse left the room to fetch a glass of water. She slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. "Arthur," she whispered. He turned, and the relief that washed over his face was so profound it was heartbreaking. "Lena," he breathed. "He told me you were leaving." "I have to," she said gently, moving to his side. "Marcus has made it clear I'm no longer welcome." His agitation returned immediately. He began to pace the small area between the bed and the window, his hands twisting together. No, you can't. He doesn't understand. He's going to send me away, I know it, to one of those places. A home. White walls and the smell of bleach. A place to wait for the end." His breathing grew shallow, his panic escalating. Alina reached for the familiar gray and blue blanket which was folded neatly at the foot of his bed. She unfolded it and draped it over his shoulders. The effect was instantaneous. The familiar weight, the scent, the texture, it was an anchor. His pacing slowed and his breathing deepened. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the blanket pulled tightly around him. If you were there, would you step closer or stay silent? The line between employee and family had been blurred for years. "He doesn't know about the promise, Lena," he whispered, his voice desperate. He gripped her hand, his touch surprisingly strong. "When my wife passed, you were the only one who, you promised me I would stay here, in my home, with my books, my garden. You gave me your word." "I remember," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I remember every word, Arthur." "He thinks it's about the money," Arthur continued, a tear tracing a path through the wrinkled landscape of his cheek. "It's not. It's about this." He gestured around the room at the faded photographs on his dresser, the worn armchair, the view of the garden he and his late wife had planted together. "It's about memory. He wants to erase it all. Erase me." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "You're the only one who knows, the only one I trust." In that moment, her moral obligation became an unbreakable vow. This was no longer about a job or a severance check. It was about a promise made to a dying woman about her husband. It was about honoring a man's last wish to die with dignity in the home he had built. Marcus saw her as a complication to be removed. But for Arthur, she was his last line of defense. Alina returned to her room, her mind racing. Arthur's words had crystallized everything. He's going to send me away. It wasn't a paranoid fear, it was a statement of fact. She now understood the full scope of Marcus's plan. The trap wasn't just about getting rid of her, it was about getting rid of his father. She thought back over the past few months, re-examining small, seemingly insignificant events through this new, terrifying lens. The new financial advisor Marcus had hired, one who specialized in estate liquidity. The brochures for high-end assisted living facilities that had been discreetly left on the hall table, then quickly whisked away when she approached. The sudden insistence on a full medical evaluation to assess Arthur's cognitive baseline. It was all a carefully orchestrated campaign to build a legal case. Marcus was manufacturing a narrative of a doddering, incompetent old man who was a danger to himself, being manipulated by a cunning caregiver. A narrative that would allow him to petition a court for full guardianship, giving him the power to override his father's will, sell his assets, and move him into a facility against his express wishes. Have you seen a rule used like a weapon? Marcus was using the very concept of care as a justification for control. The flawed NDA was another piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just sloppy, it was hasty. He was moving quickly, trying to remove her from the board before she could interfere. Her presence was a threat not because of her emotional bond with Arthur, but because she was a witness. She knew Arthur was lucid. She knew his mind was sharp, even if his body was failing. She knew he was perfectly capable of making his own decisions. Her testimony alone could dismantle Marcus's entire case. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. Isolate the target, discredit the guardian, seize control under the guise of protection. By firing her, Marcus wasn't just removing an employee, he was removing the key witness for the defense. He was silencing the one person who could speak to Arthur's true state of mind and his deepest desires. The choice was now brutally clear. She could take the severance check, which, she now realized, was essentially hush money, and walk away, allowing Marcus to succeed. She would be financially secure, but she would live with the knowledge that she had betrayed Arthur and broken her promise. Or she could resist, risking everything, her livelihood, her reputation, perhaps even her legal status, to fight for a frail old man against his powerful, ruthless son. Comply and lose her dignity, or resist and risk losing everything else. Lena's quiet defiance of the NDA had only strengthened Marcus's resolve. He was a man who did not tolerate being outmaneuvered. The next morning, the retaliation began. Her keycard to the main house was deactivated. When she tried the door to the west wing, a small red light blinked, denying her entry. She was now physically barred from the man she was meant to protect. A few hours later, the stern-faced nurse from the night before, accompanied by a stone-faced security guard, knocked on her door. "Mr. Vance has instructed us that you are to remain in the staff quarters until your departure is arranged," the nurse said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Your meals will be brought to you." Imprisonment. Gentle, quiet, but imprisonment all the same. She was cut off, isolated. Her phone had no signal in the old stone building of the staff wing, a quirk of the estate she now realized was a strategic advantage for Marcus. Later that day, she saw him. Through the small, leaded glass window of her room, she could see the main house's terrace. Arthur was there, bundled into a wheelchair by the new nurse. He looked small and lost under the vast gray sky. He kept turning his head, his eyes scanning the windows of the staff wing, searching for her. The nurse offered him a thin, sterile-looking blanket, the kind used in hospitals. He pushed it away with a weak, frustrated gesture. He wanted his blanket. He wanted his friend. He was alone, surrounded by strangers in his own home. Marcus's rationale, she knew, would sound perfectly reasonable to an outsider. He was the concerned son, taking control of a difficult situation. He was protecting his vulnerable father from a confused and over-involved employee. He wasn't a villain in his own story. He was the hero, making the tough choices. What would you sacrifice to stay true to a promise? A wave of despair washed over Alina. How could she fight this? He had all the power, all the resources. She was just the maid locked in her room, her voice silenced. The system was designed to protect men like Marcus, to validate their authority and dismiss the concerns of women like her. The door was closed. The connection was cut. It felt like checkmate. She sat on the edge of her simple cot, the silence of the room pressing in on her. For a moment she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her helplessness. All was lost. Arthur was alone and she had failed him. But then, the image of his pleading eyes, the feel of his desperate grip on her hand, the memory of her promise to his dying wife, it all came rushing back. The despair receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He had underestimated her. He thought locking a door was enough to defeat her. He thought her power was limited to her proximity to his father. He was wrong. In the quiet of her small room, Elena Reyes made a silent vow. This was not over. She would not let him erase Arthur. She would not let him win. He had left her with nothing, which meant she had nothing left to lose. The new nurse brought her dinner on a tray, a bland, unseasoned piece of chicken with overcooked vegetables. A prisoner's meal. Elena ate mechanically, her mind a whirlwind of strategy. Marcus had cut her off, but he had made a critical error. He had assumed all her connections to the world ran through him. After placing the tray outside her door, she waited. She listened until the nurse's footsteps faded down the long hall. Then she went to the back of her small closet, reached behind a loose panel in the wall, and retrieved a small, battered shoebox. Inside, nestled amongst a few faded photographs and old letters, was a cheap, disposable burner phone. A relic from a past life she never spoke of, a life that had taught her to always have a contingency plan. She took the phone to the far corner of the room, near the window where the signal was weakest but still present. 1 bar. It would have to be enough. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang 3 times before a man's voice, calm and professional, answered. "Vance, Miller and Associates. You've reached Thomas Vance." It was Arthur's nephew, the family's longtime estate lawyer, the honest one, the one Marcus had systematically pushed out of the inner circle over the past year. "Mr. Vance," Elena said, her own voice steady and devoid of panic. "This is Elena Reyes." There was a pause on the other end. "Elena, is everything all right? I was told you had resigned." "I have not resigned," she stated simply. "I am being unlawfully detained on the estate grounds on the orders of Marcus Vance, who is preventing me from performing my fiduciary duties." Another, longer pause. The word fiduciary hung in the air between them. It was a word with specific legal gravity. A word a maid had no business knowing. "Elena," the lawyer said slowly, his voice now laced with caution and intrigue, "what fiduciary duties are you referring to?" This is where everything could flip. "I am invoking Article 3, Section 2 of the Vance Family Trust, executed on April 12, 2018, Elena said, reciting the line from memory. "I am formally requesting you schedule an emergency board meeting of the trustees within the next 24 hours. The primary beneficiary, Arthur Vance, is at significant risk of physical and financial harm due to the actions of his co-trustee." The silence on the other end of the line was now electric. Thomas Vance knew the trust document better than anyone. He knew exactly what Article 3, Section 2 contained. He also knew that only 3 people were privy to its contents: himself, Arthur, and the mysterious, unnamed second trustee. "I'll be there at 9 a.m. tomorrow," the lawyer said, his voice now a mixture of shock and dawning realization. "In the main library. Don't worry, Elena, I'll make sure you have access." She ended the call and put the phone away. Her plan was in motion. It was a simple plan, relying not on a complex attack, but on a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The next morning, she did not wait to be escorted. She walked out of her room, past a stunned-looking nurse, and through the corridors of the main house as if she owned them. She was no longer wearing her uniform. She was dressed in a simple but elegant black dress she had saved for emergencies. She was no longer the help. She was walking into the proving ground. The library was as grand and imposing as a cathedral, with floor-to-ceiling shelves of books that had gone unread for a generation. Marcus was there, along with his wife Caroline and the young, flustered lawyer from the day before. They sat on one side of a massive, polished mahogany table. On the other side sat Thomas Vance, his face grim, a leather-bound folio resting before him. Marcus smirked when Elena walked in. "What is the meaning of this, Thomas?" "I thought we agreed you would handle her exit." "There is no exit to handle," Thomas said calmly. "Elena has called this meeting, as is her right." "Her right? Marcus scoffed, a short, ugly laugh. She's a domestic employee. Her only right is to the severance package I so generously offered her. Alina took a seat beside Thomas Vance, directly opposite Marcus. She folded her hands on the table and waited. Marcus launched into a self-righteous tirade, detailing Alina's insubordination, her inappropriate emotional attachment to his father, and her destabilizing influence. He painted himself as the dutiful son, forced to make a difficult decision for his father's own good. He was confident, arrogant, performing for an audience he believed was already on his side. When he finally finished, a smug look of triumph on his face, Thomas Vance did not respond. He simply opened the leather-bound folio. The Vance Family Trust. Marcus, the lawyer began, his voice resonating in the quiet room. Your father was a brilliant man. But he was not a fool. He knew your ambitions, and he took steps to protect himself. He turned a page. I'm going to read from Article 3, Section 2, the clause upon which this meeting was called. In the event that I, Arthur Vance, am declared medically or legally incapacitated, or am otherwise deemed unable to manage my own affairs, I hereby name my son, Marcus Vance, and my most trusted friend and guardian, Alina Reyes, as co-trustees of my estate. The room went so still that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a hammer blow. Caroline's perfectly painted smile froze and shattered. The young lawyer's jaw went slack. Marcus's face was a mask of disbelief. What did you say? Co-trustee? That's impossible. She's the maid. Thomas Vance continued, his voice steady and clear. The clause continues. In any matter where the co-trustees are in disagreement, specifically concerning my physical and emotional well-being, my choice of residence, or the allocation of funds from my personal accounts for my care, Miss Reyes is granted sole and absolute veto power. Did you feel that shift? It was the sound of an entire world turning upside down. The power in the room didn't just shift, it reversed its polarity with the force of a tectonic event. Alina Reyes, the invisible woman, the help, the functionary, was now the single most powerful person in the room. Her quiet, observant presence had been a guardianship in waiting. Marcus stared at her, his face ashen, all the color drained from it. He was looking at the woman he had tried to fire, to bribe, to imprison. The woman whose deep bond with his father he had treated with such contempt. And he was finally, truly seeing her for the first time, not as the help, but as the gatekeeper. The one obstacle his ambition and his cruelty could not overcome. The consequences were about to land, and he was directly in their path. This is a joke, Marcus stammered, his voice cracking. He lunged across the table, grabbing for the trust document. He was senile when he signed this. She manipulated him. It won't stand up in court. Thomas Vance calmly pulled the folio out of his reach. On the contrary, Marcus, I have a signed affidavit from his neurologist, dated the same day as the trust amendment, confirming that your father was of exceptionally sound mind. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was protecting himself from you. The finality of the lawyer's words struck Marcus like a physical blow. He sank back into his chair, defeated. All the fight went out of him, replaced by a sullen, childish rage. He glared at Alina, his eyes full of hatred. He expected a triumphant speech, a list of demands, the vengeful turn of the screw. But Alina didn't even look at him. She looked at Thomas Vance. My only concern is Arthur's well-being as per the explicit instructions of the trust, she said, her voice a calm anchor in the turbulent room. Therefore, my first official act as co-trustee is to veto my termination. I will be resuming my duties immediately. She paused, letting the words settle. My second act is to veto any and all plans, current or future, to move Arthur from his home. He will remain at the estate, under my direct care, for the remainder of his life. Caroline let out a small, strangled gasp. The life she had envisioned, selling the rambling old estate, moving to a modern penthouse downtown, had just vanished. Lena continued, her focus unwavering. My third act is to activate the Arthur Vance Dignity Fund, as outlined in Article 5 of the Trust. Please begin the process of liquidating the specified assets and establishing the Foundation's charter. I will serve as its executive director. What does real justice look like here? Not in punishment, but in restoration. She hadn't demanded an apology. She hadn't threatened legal action against Marcus for his behavior. She hadn't sought revenge. Her justice was not punitive, it was purely, beautifully restorative. She dismantled his power not by attacking him, but by simply and completely enacting Arthur's true wishes. She stripped him of his control over his father's life, his home, and a significant portion of his wealth, all without ever raising her voice. She had chosen grace over vengeance, using her newfound power not to crush her opponent, but to build a legacy. The stakeholders, the lawyers, the family, the very memory of Arthur, had no choice but to weigh her proposal and find it unimpeachable. The creation of the Arthur Vance Dignity Fund was not a vague, symbolic gesture. It was a concrete, systemic change. Alina, working closely with Thomas Vance, oversaw every detail. The fund's mission was written into its charter with legal precision, to provide financial grants to low- and middle-income families, enabling them to afford high-quality, in-home care for elderly relatives, thereby preventing premature or unnecessary institutionalization. The policy was named the Guardian Grant Program. Alina herself wrote the criteria for applicants. The process was designed to be simple and humane, free of the bureaucratic red tape that so often prevents aid from reaching those who need it most. The enforcement was her responsibility, as the trust named her the sole administrator of the fund with a lifetime appointment. This was the restitution. It wasn't about punishing Marcus. It was about transforming a portion of the Vance fortune from a private hoard into a public good. It was a systemic fix for a problem she had witnessed firsthand. The very system that had almost allowed Marcus to tuck his father away in a home was now being re-engineered by her to do the opposite for countless others. Would this change be enough in your workplace? A policy with a name, a clear owner, and a direct line to preventing future harm. Marcus was forced to watch as millions of dollars he had considered his birthright were siphoned into a cause he cared nothing about. He remained a co-trustee of the estate on paper, but his power was neutered. Alina's veto hung over every decision. He could not sell a stock or a piece of art without her consent, and she would only grant it if it served Arthur's comfort or the fund's mission. The change rippled through the household. The stern-faced nurses were dismissed. The old staff, who had been loyal to Arthur, were reinstated with pay raises. The atmosphere in the house began to shift from one of tense oppression to one of quiet, respectful calm. Alina's authority was absolute but gently wielded. She did not rule by fear, as Marcus had, but by competence and compassion. The path had opened, not just for her, but for a new way of doing things, one rooted in dignity. A week later, the familiar rhythm of the house had been restored. On a bright, cool afternoon, Alina found Arthur in the garden, sitting in his favorite spot under the shade of a large oak tree. He was wrapped in his worn, hand-knitted blanket, watching a small bluebird peck at a feeder. She came not with a tray or a list of duties, but with a book of poetry. She pulled up a chair and sat beside him. For a long while they sat in comfortable silence, simply sharing the calm of the afternoon. The air smelled of damp earth and late-blooming roses. "He came to see me this morning," Arthur said finally, his voice soft. "I know," Alina replied. She had seen Marcus leaving, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. "He apologized," Arthur continued, a note of wonder in his voice. "I don't think I've ever heard him apologize for anything in his life." Alina said nothing, simply listening. This was his moment, his healing. "He doesn't understand love," Arthur mused, his gaze distant. "He understands ownership, possession. He thought I was a thing to be managed. You always knew I was still here." He tapped a frail finger against his temple. "Still inside." She reached over and placed her hand on his. "I always saw you, Arthur." He turned his head and gave her a smile, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached his eyes. "You kept your promise, Lena, the one I made you make to her." He looked up at the sky. "She would be so proud of you." In that quiet moment, the roles they had been forced to play, master and servant, patient and caregiver, fell away completely. They were simply two friends, two souls bound by a promise, sitting in a garden. The healing wasn't in the legal victory or the reversal of power. It was here, in the quiet restoration of their bond, now free from the threat of being torn asunder. She had not only saved his home, she had reclaimed his personhood, and in doing so had fully reclaimed her own. whose voice helped you heal when no one clapped. For Arthur, and for Alina, it was each other's. The recognition, when it came, was as quiet and dignified as Alina herself. There were no press conferences or grand announcements. A few weeks after the emergency meeting, Marcus approached her in the hallway. He looked tired, diminished. The arrogance had been scraped away, leaving something raw and humbled behind. "I've been reviewing the charter for the fund," he said, avoiding her eyes. "The grant program, it's what he would have wanted. He always used to say that a man's real worth is what he gives back." He finally looked at her. "He always said you understood him better than I did. He was right." It was the closest he would ever come to an apology, and it was enough. It was an acknowledgement of her wisdom, her insight, her rightful place in his father's life. Later that week, Thomas Vance came to the estate. He found Alina in the study, organizing Arthur's papers. He handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a set of old, ornate brass keys. These were his personal keys to the house, the lawyer said. Not the master keys for the staff. His. He wanted you to have them. He paused. Arthur always said you were the most astute judge of character he'd ever met. He chose well, Alina. You are the steward of this house now and of its legacy. This was the recognition that mattered. It wasn't praise or a promotion. It was the quiet, formal transfer of trust and responsibility. It wasn't a savior narrative. It was a specific appreciation of her competence and Arthur's faith in her. She had earned this, not through a single dramatic act, but through 7 years of quiet, unwavering loyalty. By honoring her, Thomas and a humbled Marcus were honoring Arthur's final, wisest decision. And in doing so, a door was opening for a new kind of leadership in the Vance family, one based not on bloodline but on character. The first meeting of the Guardian Grant Committee was held in the estate's formal dining room. Alina sat at the head of the long, polished table, a position once occupied by Arthur. She, Thomas Vance, and a retired social worker reviewed the first round of applications. They chose a family from a nearby town, a daughter, a schoolteacher, who was struggling to care for her aging mother, a former librarian with dementia. The grant would allow her to hire part-time help, to afford the proper medications, to keep her mother in the familiar comfort of her own home for a few more precious years. A week later, Alina drove to their small, tidy bungalow herself. She met the daughter, a warm woman with tired eyes, and her mother, who sat in a rocking chair by the window, a vacant but peaceful expression on her face. Alina explained the grant, handed her the first check, and saw the daughter's eyes fill with tears of relief. Before she left, Alina went back to her car and returned with a large, beautifully wrapped gift box. Inside was a new hand-knitted blanket, identical in pattern and color, heather gray and deep ocean blue, to the one she had made for Arthur. The wool was soft and smelled faintly of lavender. Did the object's meaning change for you too? "I find that dignity often begins with warmth," Alina said, placing the blanket gently over the old woman's lap. The daughter reached out and touched the soft wool, her expression one of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. No one has ever shown us a kindness like this." The blanket was no longer just Arthur's. It was no longer a personal object of comfort, a flashpoint in a power struggle. It had been transformed. It was now the emblem of the fund, a symbol of the mission. It represented warmth, safety, and the radical act of caring for one another with dignity. It was the echo of her quiet promise to Arthur, now resonating out in the world, ready for a future she would build. The final scene is set 2 years later. Arthur has since passed away, peacefully in his own bed in his own room with Alina holding his hand. The study, once Marcus's cold office and then Arthur's quiet sanctuary, is now the command center for the Arthur Vance Dignity Fund. Alina sits not at a small, functional desk, but at Arthur's grand mahogany one. She is not in uniform, but in a professional but comfortable dress. She is on the phone, her voice calm and compassionate, as she walks another family through the grant application process. The room is hers now. It has been transformed, just as she has. On the wall behind her hangs a beautiful, candid portrait of Arthur, taken in the garden, a genuine smile on his face. And draped carefully over the leather wingback chair where he once sat, is the original, worn, hand-knitted blanket. It is a permanent fixture in the room, a quiet testament to where this all began. The fund has grown, helping dozens of families. It has become the Vance family's public identity, eclipsing the stories of corporate takeovers and market speculation. The legacy is no longer one of cold wealth, but of quiet compassion. Alina finishes her call and swivels in the chair to look out the window at the rose garden, now perfectly tended. There is a sense of profound peace, of purpose fulfilled. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek revenge. She simply honored a promise, and in doing so changed everything. The room is still. Her dignity is a quiet, powerful force that fills the space. A legacy of care has been built, one that will echo for generations. What does it truly mean to be a guardian? Sometimes it simply means to see and to remember when everyone else has chosen to forget.